Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the Political Studies Association of the UK's annual lecture for 2023, which has been made possible through our partnership with Sage Publishing. I'm Dr. Rose Gann, Chair of the PSA, and like you, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from two impressive members of the Political Studies Association community. Professor Kate Dommett from the University of Sheffield and the University of Strathclyde's Professor Sir John Curtice. Kate and John will be using their research expertise to help us get under the skin of the next general election and the trends we are likely to see in campaigning and voter behaviour. A huge thank you to Kate and John, who, as well as sharing their time and talent with us today, will also be capturing their presentations in a future edition of the PSA's Political Insight magazine. Political Insight magazine is edited by writer and journalist Peter Geoghegan, and I'm very grateful to Peter for agreeing to chair the event this afternoon. Thank you, Peter, for your support, and without further ado, I will hand over to you to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Rose. It's absolutely lovely to be here, and it's a huge honour to be able to present this year's Political Studies Association annual lecture. Welcome everybody, welcome everybody who's come. There'll be an opportunity later on to ask questions, but you can please do raise questions as you go if you want. There's a Q&A box. I think there's going to be really interesting and plenty of discussion here between these two speakers who in many ways from the political studies world and the wider world really don't need any introduction, but introduce them I will, because what would we be if we weren't going to do that? And so first of all, I want to introduce Professor Kate Dommett, who's going to be talking on general election campaigning, including the role of digital and AI and what her research is telling us about what this might look like, especially ahead of, well, we're calling it the 2024 general election. So, fingers crossed it happens in 2024. Obviously, it can go until January 2025, but Kate's going to be talking to us about that. And Kate is the Professor of Digital Politics at the University of Sheffield. And for those who aren't familiar, her research focuses on digital campaigning, things like political advertising, data and democracy. And Kate has published extensively on the implications of digital democracy for elections and political institutions. I must confess, I spoke to Kate even when I was writing my last book too, and she's an incredible source of information and expertise and cutting edge research in all of these areas. And Kate's first book, The Reimagined Party, was published in 2020, and her forthcoming book, Data-Driven Campaigning in Political Parties, 5 Advanced Democracies Compared, will shortly be published with Oxford University Press. And you can find more research about Kate, more details about Kate's research and her publications on her website, www.katedommett.com. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kate to talk us through her presentation today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Peter. That was a lovely introduction. So I'm really pleased to be able to join you today, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about campaigning and the role of digital. So let me get my slides up. There we go. Right. So I think campaigning is particularly interesting because next year, 2024, when, as Peter said, all bets are that we are likely to see a general election in the UK. Next year is actually a huge year for elections. So at the moment, we're going to see at least 58 elections in 54 countries. So we're going to have the US presidential election, there's going to be elections in India, in Russia, in Croatia, in Uruguay, in a whole host of different countries. There's also going to be the European parliamentary elections, so a huge swathe of Europe will be running campaigns, and we're most likely going to see this campaign at the general election in the UK. So really interesting context in which to think about campaigning and what's going on. Now, one of the major trends that has been focused on so far in thinking about this up and coming campaign is AI. Now, it's quite fortuitous that this lecture is being given the same week as the AI Summit is going on. But you'll have probably seen these are just a few examples of the kinds of headlines that are being written already. That is threat of AI potentially eroding democracy. Now, I think this is really interesting because, you know, AI has really broken onto the public consciousness in the last kind of 6 months. So we've seen this kind of generative AI tools, such as kind of ChatGPT or Google Bard. For those in the university sector, we've also kind of seen these tools that are helping students write essays. And there's just been this real growth and kind of breakthrough in the public consciousness around AI and its capacity. Now, thinking about that in the context of elections, we've seen these kind of focus on how those capabilities might actually pose a real threat to elections in the next year. And there have been quite a few examples that have fueled these concerns. So some of you might have seen coverage, for example, of the Republican AI-generated campaign video in the US. There have also been examples of deep fakes of Joe Biden calling for a national draft. And we've even had in the UK in recent months an audio of Keir Starmer, which appears to have been a deep fake as well. So these kind of examples are starting to pop through and permeate public consciousness. And the reason that they seem to be so concerning is that they raise these questions about how do we know what to trust? You know, if you can't trust that what you're seeing in terms of campaign material is authentic, like, how are you supposed to make those decisions that actually stand at the kind of the heart of what we think about with elections and democracy, which is that as individual citizens, we should be able to make informed decisions about who to vote for. So if you can't be informed in a reliable way, that really kind of threatens this idea of how we think democracy works. So I think this threat of AI is really interesting, because for me, it kind of harks back to a narrative that we had at the last election. So if you think back to 2019, there was similar kind of narrative of threat. So we had this real focus on the Cambridge Analytica scandal. This is something I've thought far too much about, but just to kind of briefly remind people, this was this concern that digital technology had essentially made it possible to gather so much personal information about us that political parties and campaigns could build these like huge sophisticated databases that had all of this individual level information about our interests, about the kind of messages that we responded to, and that could be used by political campaigns to develop highly persuasive messages that could in fact be manipulative. And we had this teamed with this idea of online political advertising, particularly on platforms like Facebook, where political campaigns could take these databases and they could generate hundreds of individual messages for individual voters. And there was this real concern that there was a potential for manipulation. Now, this narrative was kind of also complemented by concerns about foreign interference and around bots, but they got a lot of coverage last time. And again, we heard those fears for democracy about discourse becoming really fragmented, and it not being possible for us to have this common informed debate because maybe different people being told different things. Now, at the last election, I was quite skeptical of this because a lot of these kind of claims were coming from people who were involved in campaigns themselves. So, you know, people who are running them saying, oh, you know, we're using this really fine, detailed micro-targeting, and that's what won us the election. And my instinct in those situations is always to kind of pause and go, are they really the most reliable sources of information that we should be talking on? You know, should we be listening to companies that are ultimately trying to sell a product or push their own reputation up? Are they the most reliable, and should we be a bit more skeptical? And I think that kind of is important as a point to read over to this next election and what the campaign is going to look like in 2024 in the UK and internationally. So, you know, what can we learn from looking back to the narratives in 2019 for thinking about the narratives that we're starting to hear today around AI? And to do so, I think we're quite fortunate because we've now got quite a lot of evidence about Cambridge Analytica, about these claims of micro-targeting. And I think they tell a really interesting story that offers us lessons for like what we might expect at the next election. So if we look back at what we know. So if we start with this idea of targeting. So I kind of mentioned that one of the real fears was around micro-targeting and this fragmentation of the electorate. And there's been some absolutely fantastic work done on this. And we've got newly available data that really allows us to understand what's going on in the digital realm that we've never had previously. So this graph is from some research that's done by Fabio Votta, who is an incredible researcher based in Amsterdam. And he's been using this information about targeting parameters that are used on Facebook for advertising audiences. And what he was looking at was how many targeting criteria were being used when an advert was placed. And what he found is that on average, for most targeted messages, only 1 or 2 criteria are used. And it's only in a few places, like noticeably the US, and also France on this map, that we can see that these more multiple targeting criteria are being used. So what does that mean? So if you think about a targeting criteria, it's things like age or geographic location or gender. So if we're only seeing 1 or 2 of these used, that's quite big groups of voters. You know, it could be that the geographic location is Sheffield and they're targeting women, but that's a lot of people still within that group. So these kind of, the evidence of this really fine-grained targeting wasn't quite there, but we can kind of say that some limited targeting was present and was used. And this is something that I found in my own research. So Peter mentioned the book that is forthcoming, that is just about to come out. And we spoke to over 300 campaigners and officials within party campaigns in 5 countries. And we're told again and again that most of the time they just do quite simple targeting. In the UK, for example, it tends to be geographic. That makes a lot of sense because it aligns with what we know about the voting system and the fact that certain constituencies are more important than others. So speaking to voters in certain places becomes important, but speaking to a very, very small community who maybe like dogs and spend their evenings out fishing, you know, probably isn't the priority for them. They still want to be speaking and communicating with quite large groups of voters. So some of these fears don't really seem to be borne out in practice, even though we can see an evolution in campaigning. So what else do we know? We also know that this idea about parties having really sophisticated and large databases isn't quite played out in practice as well. So for the most part, political campaigns tend to rely on publicly available information and data that they gather themselves. So this picture on the left is of the marked register. It's some training actually by the Labour Party about how you input this into your database. Now, the electoral register is something that is freely provided by political parties, by the state to political parties, and it contains really basic information like who lives at a particular address, are they registered to vote, and what age do they become eligible to vote? So when do they turn 18? The marked register can then be bought by political parties, and all it tells you is, did someone actually turn out and cast a ballot at an election? So it doesn't tell you who they voted for, but it tells you, did they vote? And that information is incredibly useful for political campaigns, because if you know that someone only votes sometimes, you know that you should focus your campaign effort on trying to make them vote this time round. So it's kind of relatively simple insights. We also know that they tend to rely on canvassing data or data about voting intention. And this is often just gained by door knocking or by people filling in survey cards. Now, when I've talked to, again, political campaigns internationally, they say that like these 2 sources of information are the most commonly used and most important. It's like, where does someone live and how are they intending to vote? So although it is possible to get a lot more digital fine-grained data, it's not actually used. For the most part, it tends to be quite simple selections and quite broad groups of voters that campaigns are reaching out to. So I think there's kind of some rough exceptions to this. We do see some political parties doing more sophisticated modelling. So there's things like someone's propensity to vote for a political party or their tendency to be a supporter, but it's not very widespread and it's not as sophisticated and concerning, I think, is a lot of the narrative around these like massive databases initially suggested. And then my third bit of evidence about what was going on, how that related to existing those previous concerns, is around advertising. So it was often claimed that online political advertising would manipulate voters and that we would need to be really concerned about it. Now, research has shown that overall, online political adverts have a limited effect. So one study in the US found that just 0.7% found a 0.7% effect of online political adverts on an individual's vote choice. And it was also shown that that result wasn't significant. So it's a really small impact that online political adverts are having. We also know for some work that I've been doing at Sheffield with some of my colleagues, is that the adverts kind of placed by political parties, when you show someone an advert and say, is this acceptable? The vast majority of adverts are seen to be acceptable. They're not seen to kind of contain deeply problematic content that is trying to manipulate people. So this doesn't mean that there's no problematic content and that there aren't efforts to demobilize people or say problematic things, but the vast majority of adverts that were placed by political parties and campaigns at their last election were broadly acceptable. So what does this all mean for fears around AI? This is all quite looking back, but I want to start looking forward now. So I think what it shows is that we have this kind of tendency to really fear and overstate the impact of new technologies. And this is not a new tendency. There's been some brilliant research that's kind of shown, basically take any technology and you can find examples like this one on the slide. You know, it's either not going to have an impact or it's going to have these huge concerns. So there is a lovely bit of work that talks about how the radio is going to be corrupting the minds of children, and we all need to have huge fears about the impact of the radio. So these kind of narratives tend to come up again. And I think when we look at those examples, you know, often the practice of how new technology is used doesn't live up to the concerns and the potential threats that it can pose. So this isn't to say that we shouldn't be worried about AI. I think clearly there are kind of important implications around how citizens can navigate the information landscape and how it's used and how we know it's being used. But it does suggest that I think we shouldn't focus too much on AI. And I think actually there is a really important reason not to, is that, you know, there have been relatively few examples of problematic uses of AI so far, and yet they've got this huge disproportionate coverage in the media. And I think we have to think about, you know, almost by covering these things, you drive the very fuels and concerns that you're hoping to prevent. So I think there's a real responsibility about how we talk about AI and how we talk about practice the next election. So if AI is relevant, how is it most likely to feature? So for people who don't spend their time like me thinking far too much about election campaigns, I think it's quite often surprising to when you find out like how small campaign teams are. So I particularly look at digital campaigning, and this organogram on the right is from a post-election report that was done on the Labour Party after 2019. And if you see those kind of figures at the bottom in the red, there's only kind of 10 people who are responsible for digital. It's quite a small number. And if you think about what they're doing every single piece of social media content that's put out on multiple channels. They're maintaining databases, they're often running analysis, they're doing analytics, they're interfacing with the polling team, and quite often they're also fixing the computers and the laptops within the office. Now, this is Labour, this is a well-resourced campaign. If you look at the smaller parties, they're lucky if they've got 1 or 2 people working on technology. And so I think the most likely place where we're going to see AI used is around kind of simplifying some of these back office roles that are currently done by people who are really overworked. So it might be things like, you know, doing things like running some analysis on a data set rather than an individual having to do it, or doing a kind of first draft of some campaign material that's then used as a stimulus to work up some additional kind of content. I think it's also kind of worth noting that this is where AI is going to be used, because actually AI is really risky, and political parties and campaigns are often really risk-averse organisations. They don't want to be found out as having used AI or being seen to be misleading or duplicitous. And it has come up again and again in the interviews I've done. They tend to be much more cautious about using these tools because they don't want to have that backlash effect. So I think we're unlikely to see AI in the kind of public-facing materials of political parties, but we are more likely to see it potentially in some of the bigger parties next time around, but certainly in 5 years after that, maybe more extensively in these kind of back office tasks. So if AI isn't the story, then what is? So I think the digital campaigning has basically become the norm. And I think that by studying the digital campaign and not AI, we can actually learn all of these interesting insights into how political parties understand the competition dynamic in which they are operating. So there have been these newly available tools. They were kind of in place at the last election, but I think they've now got new capacities so we can build up this picture of what's going on. And also, I think those of us who researched the digital campaign have a bit more an understanding of what we can do with these tools. They were quite new last time round. So some of you might not be familiar, but the main big digital providers have now created these advertising archives. So Meta have one, which allows you to look at what's being spent on advertising on Facebook and Instagram, and Google has one. And then some of the smaller platforms have some partial ones. So Snap used to have one, and TikTok is now experimenting at the moment with it. Now, these data sources allow you to kind of look at the online political advertising that is on these platforms and trace what different parties are doing and where they're spending money. So you can look at the overall amount, but you can also look at the kind of amounts in particular places, in particular parties. Now, if you're interested in this, then I would thoroughly recommend that you go and download the Who Targets Me extension. So this is a great organization that has built this plugin that you can download onto your computer, and you can see where you're being targeted and what kind of ads are going on in your constituency. And they also have these great dashboards like this one here, which allows you to see where money is being spent. So I think this is really interesting. It helps you understand by looking like in which constituencies, in which places are parties putting a lot of money in their terms of their digital campaign material. And that can kind of help us start to understand what are the dynamics, where do parties think their marginals are, and where's being neglected, where's written off, and where might we find those kind of plucky people who are trying to buck the national campaign trend. We can also use this data to kind of look at who's being targeted. So a lot of these sites have quite broad, admittedly, categories that help you understand what's going on behind an advert. So you can see on the right, you can now see there's this bit at the bottom that says, on this advert, there were no age criteria included, but sometimes you find specific ages or specific genders are being targeted with adverts online, and we can get a bit more of an understanding of who are political parties trying to speak to, how much are they differentiating their audience, and kind of what's going on under the surface of this. And there's quite a lot of newly available data that wasn't around last time around these kind of targeting criteria that as academics we have access to. So that's really exciting in terms of potential. And why this is so interesting is, like previously, if we wanted to understand where parties were campaigning and who they were targeting, you're basically reliant on things like surveying election agents, or something I've done also far too much, which is trawling through Electoral Commission spending returns. But they are available far after an election. The great thing about these kind of resources is that they're available in real time. So we can monitor in real time as campaign decisions are being made, like what's going on. You can also kind of look at who is campaigning, and I think this is also a really interesting question. So most of my work looks at political parties and leaders, but we can also kind of look at those other organisations that are active in election campaigns. Why this is particularly interesting is there was quite a lot of examples last time around of kind of different organisations coming up that were either attacking certain parties or changed their positions, and there were some really interesting stories about who is behind some of these organisations. I think what's going to be interesting is like the government have changed the law, so now all digital campaign material now requires an imprint to tell you who's behind it. So we're going to have a little bit more real-time information about who is active in a campaign. So I think this is all great. We've got the capacity to monitor in real time. It's going to be really exciting to see how digital is being used. But I want to kind of pause and just go back to that point I started with at the beginning. So next year is a huge year of elections. And at the moment, Meta and Google are largely the providers of these resources to allow us to understand what's going on in digital. But Meta and Google have also sacked a lot of the people who help run and maintain these tools, we already know from the academic work that's been done that a lot of these archives that help us understand these dynamics are quite glitchy, they're not very reliable, and they can quite often go wrong in election time. Indeed, they did in 2019. So with so many elections happening at the same time, there is potential increased risk that these archives might go down. And if they do, we're going to lose our capacity to understand what's happening at the election. It's also really important to say that these companies have changed their policies as well. So they now require political campaigners to register. And in doing so, they've encouraged campaigners to kind of go off and use other tools and other platforms that don't have this kind of transparency requirement. So there's going to be whole massive swathes of digital activity that we can't study. This is a real problem. And I think, you know, it shows really the importance of us as an academic community pushing for data access to be able to study what's going on online. So I think that kind of brings me to a point about, you know, it's not just digital. Like, I am professor of digital politics. I love digital campaigning, but I think that it's so important to think it's actually not just all about digital. What we've seen in how parties have campaigned and how their operations have evolved is that digital is definitely a site for more investment, but political parties still spend most of their money on traditional activity. They still focus on leaflets, they still focus on door knocking, and that is the kind of major area of their investment. So it raises interesting questions about how this coming election, are we going to see digital campaigning blended with more traditional offline campaigning? Now, I think this kind of questions around offline are really interesting to consider, because the dynamics since the last election have changed a lot. You know, we've had COVID in between then, and a lot of the anecdotal evidence I'm getting is that both activists and people on the doorstep are less willing to have those doorstep conversations. So it's going to be interesting to see, you know, to monitor what's happening on the ground, and is doorstep canvassing as effective as it has been in the past, or are people more reluctant to talk on the doorstep? I also think it's going to be very interesting if this election does end up happening next autumn. So I keep hearing next October. Never really a good time to be going out on the doorstep. So we might see campaigns relying more on leaflets, maybe more on direct mail and digital. So I think we've got a whole series of unanswered questions about how are political campaigns going to mix these different ways of connecting with voters that they have. I think that's all quite uncertain. But I think the thing I think is going to be most important for helping us get this real understanding of campaigning is focusing on places and the mix of different media that campaigns are using to connect with us. So we can't just focus on digital campaigning techniques and on the memes and videos and adverts that parties are using. We need to kind of look in the round, you know, how are they using those things, but how are they also doing doorstep campaigning? How are they designing their leaflets? Are they using leader visits? All those kind of things. So I will end on this, which is kind of, you know, what does this all mean for campaigning in 2024? So I think first off, I would just plead with people, don't get distracted by AI. It will play a small role, but it's not the story. And I think actually making that the story raises concerns about us maybe amplifying something that won't turn out to be as problematic as potentially feared. I think we need to resist this techno pessimism and this culture of fear, and concentrate on how digital technology and these tools can be used for positive ends. I think we really need to kind of look at these new tools for understanding strategy in real time and monitor those, but also making sure that we don't ignore the ground campaign. And I think this kind of forthcoming election is going to be absolutely fascinating for seeing how campaigns are evolving, how they're adapting, and how we see, if we see political parties doing anything radically different. But my suggestion is that I think it'll be business as normal for the most part. And I'll leave it there. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was a really, really fascinating talk, and I love the idea of resisting techno-pessimism. I think that's I can see a T-shirt with that slogan somewhere that you could buy. I think we could all do resisting techno-pessimism. Really, really interesting. We'll have opportunity to ask questions to Kate in the second half of the of this lecture. But by all means, I see some of you've already done it. Please put your questions in the Q&A as well. I think there's going to be loads of questions about this, and no doubt there'll be a lot of questions as well about our next speaker, our next presentation. So I'm really, really pleased on the back of Kate's fascinating talk about, about AI and the reality of where campaigns might be. We've got now Sir John Curtice, who's going to be reflecting as well on his research about where the campaigns might be and looking ahead at where the public is likely to react and act in the next general election. We've seen so many opinion polls over the last few months, a lot of talk about polls, a lot of talk about by-elections. And I think it's really, really interesting to kind of get a deep dive that John's going to give us on this. And John's also going to be asking, like, are we going back to normal? Is our politics, after such a fractious period and so many elections that were very much framed by things like Brexit and big external factors, are we going back to normal? And, in many ways, as I said at the start, Sir John needs no introduction, but I will introduce him all the same. He's Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and also Senior Research Fellow at the National Centre for Social Research and also the UK in a Changing Europe think tank. He's written extensively about voting behaviour in elections and referendums in the UK, as well as on British political and social attitudes more generally. He's a former co-director of the British Election Study, and he's has been a co-editor of the NatSen's annual British Social Attitudes report as well for nearly 30 years. He's a regular contributor to British and international media coverage of politics in the UK, and many of you, I'm sure, will know him as a co-host of the Trendy podcast as well. And he's also a very familiar face on our TV screens on election night. And finally, last but not least, he's also the president of the British Polling Council, which promotes and regulates standards of transparency in the polling industry. John, I'm very, very pleased to hand it over to you now to give your presentation.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you to the PSA for the invitation to give this talk, and I guess in particular to force me to think a little bit beyond the media headlines, which of course is what often tends to dominate our lives and our discussion on this subject. Anyway, this slide, like Kate's, comes with the obligatory set of slides. So let us begin there. So as Peter's already indicated, I've entitled this A Return to Normality, and that obviously requires me fairly rapidly to define what I might mean by normality. And I'm really going to pick up two aspects of not the flux in the way in which people vote so much as the structure of the way in which people vote, at least historically. Quote number one comes from Peter Pulzer, the former Gladstone of politics at Oxford, who wrote a book in the late 1960s, which contained the now immortal phrase, "Class is the basis of British politics, all else is embellishment and detail." And essentially, therefore, it's the idea that electoral politics in Britain is essentially about which social class people belong to, with those in the middle class being more likely to vote Conservative, and those in the working class more likely to vote Labour, the Labour Party, of course, having been funded back in 1900 as a party to promote working class representation. So that's one thing I want to look at. It's the demographics of the way in which people vote and how that has evolved and might evolve again at the next election. The second thing I want to look at, I'm afraid my colleagues and I, when we were writing about British voting behaviour in the 1980s, Anthony Heath, Roger Joel and myself, we weren't as pithy or as quotable as Peter Pulzer. But the idea that we put forward is that if you're trying to understand how people vote and the role of people's views about public policy, debates about public policy, etc., it's not so much a question of people voting for parties on particular issues and particular policy proposals, as opposed to the fact that voting behaviour tends to be structured by where people stand on a couple of crucial value dimensions. One was essentially whether people are on the left or on the right, words we often use. Essentially that's about how your attitude towards inequality and what you think the state should do about it. But we also said there was another dimension kicking around, gets described a number of different ways: liberal, authoritarian, socially conservative versus socially liberal. It's the difference between those people who, in a sense, are comfortable living in a diverse society and those who are not. Those who think that we should be punishing people who break social mores, break the law fairly strongly, as opposed to those who think that the social mores you follow is much more up to you. So that's the two dimensions that we picked out. So the history of this, very briefly. This is just taking the last 4 elections before 2015, showing you the level of support for the Conservatives, first of all, amongst those who are professionals and managers, and then next to that, amongst those in semi-routine and routine workers, then doing the same thing for the Labour Party in the third and the fourth columns, and just doing that for each election. Now, if I were to do this over a longer time frame, you would also already be saying, well, the gap between the classes in terms of their voting behaviour is not as big now as it was 20 or 30 years ago. But as you can see, at each election, the Conservative Party was more popular amongst those who are in professional managerial jobs than amongst those in working class jobs. And conversely, the Labour Party was more popular amongst those in semi and routine occupations than those who are professional managers. Level support for parties go up and go down, but the gap between those two groups over this period is reasonably constant. So you can see, certainly as recently as 2015, class was still at least a relatively important demarker of the direction in which people tended to vote. So far as the values are concerned, I'm not going to get into the detail of how I construct this graph, but it's on the basis of a series of questions from which we can identify whether people tend to have left-wing values or right-wing values. And as you can see, if we look at the Labour Party was much more popular across these 4 elections amongst those people whom we could classify as being on the left than they were amongst those who were on the right, whereas the Conservative Party tends to be more popular amongst those on the right than those on the left. And if anything, in the 2015 election, that gap tended to widen so much. And certainly this gap was more important, and it's what I and my colleagues were writing back in the 1980s, than the second dimension, which I'm going to call here social liberals versus social conservatives. The trick is in the name. Those who voted for the Conservative Party tended to be somewhat more socially conservative, so much more likely to think that perhaps we should be punishing criminals heavily, more concerned about upholding traditional values, more concerned about immigration. But in the case of the Labour Party, actually didn't really make much difference at all. Social liberals and social conservatives were equally likely and unlikely to vote for the Labour Party. So that was the history. That's the backdrop. What I'm then going to do is 3 things. One is, well, why was Brexit potentially going to disturb this picture? 2, how did it disturb this picture through to the 2019 election? And then 3, is it going to continue to disturb this picture at the next election? Or, as many people have opined, is Brexit yesterday's story and it's no longer going to have much influence on the character and structure of voting behaviour in the UK at the next election, probably roughly this time next year? So first of all then, why was Brexit a challenge potentially to this traditional politics? Well, first thing to bear in mind is that the way in which people voted in 2019 was very, very heavily related to their views about Brexit. Particularly if you looked at people's views on Brexit as of 2019, you're talking about 83% of people who were in favour of being outside the European Union, voting for either the Conservative Party, virtually all of them, or voting for the Brexit Party. Conversely, you had about 80% of people who wanted to be inside the European Union, voting for one of the parties that said they were willing to support a second EU referendum. So Brexit really did very, very strongly demarcate politics in the 2019 election. Indeed, it did so increasingly over the course of the 2015 to 2019 elections. So if we go back to 2015, you can see that, and here I have to use the vote that people, how people voted in 2016, but you can see that people who went on to vote Remain in 2016 were rather less likely to vote Conservative in 2015 than those who voted Leave, but the gap was much narrower than it proved to be by the time we got to the 2019 election. Labour equally more popular amongst Remain voters, even in 2015, than they were amongst Leave voters. The character of their vote doesn't change so much, but it does become somewhat more pro-Remain at the margin. And certainly, so far as Liberal Democrats are concerned, a lot of the progress they made between 2015 and 2019, such as it was very heavily concentrated amongst those who were in favour of being inside the European Union. So not only was Brexit important in 2019, but it's much more important than it had been back in 2015. But how were attitudes to Brexit themselves structured? Well, the first thing they were structured by was by age. Younger people were much less likely to vote Leave than were older people. The second way in which it was structured was by education. Those with a university degree were much less likely to vote Leave than were those who had few, if any, qualifications. Now, given the latter, you won't be surprised to hear that to some degree there was indeed also a relationship with social class, although it is a weaker one than with education. But insofar as there is a relationship, it's a relationship that cuts across what we've already seen, because it's people in working class occupations who are more likely to vote Leave, those in professional managerial occupations who are less likely to do so. But of course, it was people who voted Leave who were voting Conservative in 2019, but traditionally it was professional and managerial people who voted Conservative. So you can see how Brexit cut across potentially the demographics of the way in which people voted at elections. The other thing then, the reason why Brexit is a challenge, is that although people often say people who voted for Leave were on the right and people who voted for Remain voted on the left, if you use that scale about inequality, Brexit was not a left-right issue. Whether or not people voted for Remain or Leave was largely unrelated as to whether or not people were concerned about inequality or more concerned about giving entrepreneurs the ability and the incentives to create more wealth. Indeed, if anything, those on the left on this definition were rather more likely to vote Leave than those on the right. But what the Brexit referendum was about was whether you were a social liberal or a social conservative. If you were a social liberal, you voted Remain. If you were a social conservative, you voted Conservative. You voted Leave. And because it's almost identical, because immigration was one of the central issues of the Brexit campaign, the Brexit referendum, and immigration is very much an issue that taps into people's conceptions of diversity, how comfortable they are with diversity, etc., etc. So if Brexit's going to be a basis of voting behaviour, that would suggest that this second dimension is going to take on a greater importance in our voting behaviour than it has done historically. So let's therefore look to see how the demographics and the value basis of voting behaviour panned out in the 2019 general election. Exhibit number 1, let's look at the character of support for the Conservative Party in terms of its class composition and see how it evolves. But let's first of all, far right-hand side. Support for the Conservative Party in 2019 was, if anything, lower amongst managerial and professional workers than it was amongst any other occupational class. And as you can see, you've already seen what the position was before. And again, just remind you there of 2015, that's a very, very different picture. It began to even out in 2017 because Brexit started to be an issue in the 2017 election. And then in 2019, it basically means that Peter Pulser's aphorism no longer works. The same is true of the Labour Party. Its support, once high amongst those in working class people, is by this time no higher amongst those in working class occupations than it was amongst those in managerial and professional occupations. Indeed, if anything, Labour, the party of the working class, supposedly, was a wee bit less popular amongst working class voters than was the Conservative Party. So Brexit certainly changed the shape and character of support for the parties so far as social class was concerned. In contrast, what now became the central dividing line in our voting behaviour was age. It was already there present to a degree. It was already the case as early as 2015 that younger people were more likely to vote Labour and older people more likely to vote Conservative. But as you can see, that gap widened quite substantially between 2015 and 2019, such that in the case of the Conservative Party, support was 3 times higher amongst those aged 65 and over than amongst those aged 18 to 24. That's an even bigger gap than anything we saw. I've shown you about social class, even going back to 2001. Equally, education also becomes a gap in the way that it hadn't been as recently as 2015. The Labour Party ends up doing much better amongst those with degrees, the Conservative Party doing much better amongst those with less than a GCSE. So the Labour Party, which thinks of itself as a working class party, we now discover by 2019 is essentially a party of socially liberal young professionals with university degrees, a very, very different image from the one that the party likes to think of itself, and one that certainly helps to explain some of the angst inside the Labour Party about where it found itself in the wake of the 2019 election. But it's also the case, as you might by now expect, that that division between social liberals and social conservatives does now indeed also in 2017 and in 2019 shape the character of voting behaviour more. Labour's vote is hitherto little affected by this dimension, is now much more clearly stronger amongst social liberals than amongst social conservatives, and the gap for the conservatives, such as it previously was, is now much bigger. It's not that the left-right divide disappears. Indeed, in 2015 and 2017, it was quite big, but it's no bigger now than the social liberal versus social conservative divide. Britain's politics genuinely becomes about 2 value dimensions and not just about 1. So, question now is, however, is it likely to be the case that the picture I've showed you at the beginning of this lecture is going to provide us with the better guide as to the kind of voting behaviour and its structure that we're going to have in 2024? Or is the legacy of Brexit still with us, even though the willingness of politicians to talk about Brexit, certainly the past opponents of Brexit, has been relatively limited since 2019? Well, the first thing we have to bear in mind is that attitudes towards Brexit themselves have changed. This is a running average of attitudes towards Brexit and whether or not people would vote now to rejoin or to stay out of the European Union. The grey line is the level of support for rejoining. The orange line is the level of support for staying out. And basically, since roughly around the Liz Truss regime in the autumn of 2022 and the fallout from that, support for staying out has been averaging up and down around the 58% mark, and support for staying out has been running at about 42. In other words, there's been about a 10% swing as compared with the position back in 2016, which does therefore mean, if we're going to understand the relationship between attitudes towards Brexit and how people are likely to vote, we can no longer rely adequately on how people voted in 2016. We need to look at the relationship between current attitude towards Brexit and party support. And this is what we get, and this is how it's changed. Now, the Conservative Party had virtually no support amongst Remain voters back in 2019. So it's therefore not surprising that virtually all of the collapse in Conservative support, indeed on this particular measure, all of the collapse in Conservative support has occurred amongst those who still wish to be outside the European Union. That coalition that Boris Johnson put together in 2019 of virtually 4/5 of Leave supporters voting for the Conservative Party, that coalition has been fractured over the course of the last 2 years. It's been spread, diverse, quite a lot of it's going to Reform UK. Labour Party is picking up some of it, but only some of it. Liberal Democrats even are picking up some of it as well. The Labour Party, of course, has spent a lot of time trying to attract Leave voters, and it's had a measure of success. But you will note that actually the rise in Labour support amongst those who would vote to rejoin the European Union, it's not much less than the rise in Labour support amongst those who would vote to stay out. And Labour's vote is still very heavily structured by whether people want to be inside or outside the European Union. In contrast, Liberal Democrats, who've also stopped talking about Brexit, said they've already gained ground amongst those who voted to stay out, but that's a diminishing group. They have lost ground amongst those who would vote to rejoin. So Brexit's less important than it was. And certainly that Leave coalition that supported the Conservatives is much weaker now, but it's still there to a very considerable degree. And particularly it is, as I've already suggested, there for the Labour Party. This is now taking that data and showing you what percentage of each party's current support comes from those who currently want to be inside the EU. So the Conservative Party, ironically, is now less of a pro-Leave party in terms of the character of its vote than it was in 2019, although it's still 70% Leave. The Democrats are less pro-Remain. They were virtually entirely pro-Remain voters in 2019. They are now only about 3/4. But the Labour Party, who thought once upon a time they could only ever win the next election and become sufficiently popular to win an election by reconnecting with Leave voters, the character of Labour's vote has barely changed over the course of the last 4 years. One of the reasons for this, but it's not the only reason, is that those people who have switched to Labour since the 2019 election are also people who have been particularly likely to have changed their minds about Brexit. So you can see here, for example, just taking one of these pairs of comparisons, amongst those who switched to Labour since 2019, only 25% of them voted Remain back in 2016, but 64% of them would now vote to rejoin the European Union. So the Labour Party's been, even where the Labour Party's been picking up people who voted Leave in 2016, they've been picking up people who have changed their minds since 2016. Therefore, the character of their vote has not changed as much as you might imagine. So where does all of this leave us? Well, on social class, still in a position where basically social class makes very little difference to the character of party support. The Labour Party is much more popular now than it was 4 years ago. The Conservative Party is a lot less popular, but the rise and falls in their support have essentially occurred across social classes by more or less the same extent. The relationship between age and party support is still very, very strong. Now, there's a little bit of ceiling effects here. The Conservative Party, frankly, couldn't go down much more amongst those aged 18 to 24. So that limits the drop amongst that group. But it's still, the case that the Conservative Party is much more popular amongst older voters, still most popular party amongst those over 65, as compared with the position amongst younger voters. So that's still with us. And the relationship with education is still with us as well. The Labour Party's support has risen by 12 points amongst those with a degree, and it's risen by 12 points by those without a degree. Support for the Conservative Party's particularly fallen heavily amongst those without any qualifications. That's them losing ground amongst Leave voters, but again, they've also lost ground to a degree amongst undergraduates by around 12 points. So the character of particularly of Labour's vote has not changed much, and although the gradient for the Conservatives is down, the relationship is still there in a way that's not true for social class. So the Labour Party still looks like a party that essentially is supported by socially liberal graduates with professional and managerial jobs. What about the two value divides? Well, the Conservative vote, again, as you might expect, is now less strongly rooted amongst social conservatives than it was back in 2019. But Labour's vote is still basically as rooted in social liberals as it was in 2019. And the left-right divide is still with us. It's still there. It still matters, it's still important. It's just that it's still one of two divides that is managing to structure party support. Finally, just very, very briefly before I conclude, of course, a lot of discussion also about Brexit and about how it's changed the character of party support has also been about the geography of party support, and in particular, the way in which the Labour Party lost its so-called red wall seats to the Conservatives, which were traditional Labour seats that voted for Leave. One of the polling companies, Redfield and Wall, poll what they call red wall constituencies. We can debate about their definition, but one of the things you can do is therefore to compare whether or not the Labour Party has made particular progress amongst red wall constituencies as compared with what's been going across the country as a whole, and conversely, are the Conservatives losing more ground in red wall constituencies? The answer to that, according to Redfield and Wilton, is no. Labour's progress is everywhere. That will still mean the red wall constituencies will go Labour in current circumstances because they're all relatively marginal seats and they're just going to get overblown by the current tsunami of support for Labour if it's retained. So to conclude, the strength of the link between Brexit and party choice is weaker now than it was in 2019, but it's far from disappeared, and it's disappeared least for the Labour Party. As in 2019, age and education are still the principal demographic dividing lines of our electoral politics, while social class is not a significant dividing line at all. We have not gone back to normality in that respect. And equally, the electoral battle continues to be about the social liberal versus social conservative divide in a way that was, to an extent, that was not true in the past, as well as being between left and right. Yet, and probably contrary to the expectations of many people, politicians on both sides of the political divide, despite the fact that we have not got back to normality, none of this has stopped the Labour Party becoming much more popular and the Conservatives becoming deeply unpopular, not least, of course, because certain other things have happened which have probably been crucial for determining the level of support for the parties. But the point is that change in the level has not necessarily changed the structure of our politics, that with which it looks as though we are still going to be confronted in the election next year.
John, thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating talk. A lot in there, a lot for all of us to digest. Really, really interesting. I found myself, I'm probably the only one who found myself taking screen grabs of some of your slides with my phone because I was so interested and I wanted to find out, I wanted to kind of be able to go back over them myself. We've lots of questions coming in the Q&A. Please do keep them coming. Put your questions in the Q&A and I'm going to get to them. But before we do that, I'm going to abuse my prerogative as the chair to ask the first question because, you know, why not? And it's going to be a question, I think, to both you, John, and to Kate. And what I think was really interesting about your two talks is this, in some ways you touched on this idea of normality, both of you, and change. Both change and normality. It's not the same as it was before. But in some ways we are seeing some aspects that are similar to campaigns we had in the past. But, in some ways I felt like, Kate, what you were saying is that political campaigning is still political campaigning. We're doing it in the digital age, but it's still political campaigning. And John, you've teased out really well some of those threads, which I think will come out more in some of the questions as well, around social liberalism, social conservatism, and a new structure of how voting happens in British politics. But it doesn't feel like whatever happens in the next election, we're not going to be banging on about Brexit, to quote many people. And I guess what I was wondering was, I might ask you to go first with this, Kate. What does this mean, do you think, for the campaigns when they unfold? And what does it mean for the result? That we are seeing similarities, that really this is, I know John's laughing because I'm going to ask him the same question.
I think it poses a really interesting question, because I think it will be quite a traditional campaign. It will be about, getting activists out onto the doorstep. But, we're asking them to do different things as well. It's about, not only is it having a ground campaign, it's also kind of running social media. And I think it's some really interesting work that's been done by Tim Bale and others, looking at like the demographics of party memberships and how they vary. And, some political parties have a membership base that's more naturally adept to be able to use this blend of campaigning tools than others. I think for me, it kind of comes back to this point of when the election's going to be. And, if it does end up being in the depths of winter, then the ability to be able to use a broader range of campaigning tools is going to be more important. If it's in summer, I think we might see a kind of more traditional ground campaign with lots of rallies and activities outside. So I think it's kind of it's hard to say how it's going to play out, but I think each political party is going to face like its own specific challenges that aren't so much about technology, but about how they function as organisations.
You asked me a question, Peter.
John, yes, I wanted to ask you I guess it's a double header. How you think this campaign will play out, and how do you think what it might mean on the results night?
Well, clearly we're from a standpoint of a government that is in deep political trouble, and is desperately trying to find a way out. So far, it looks as though a significant part of its strategy is based on hoping that by focusing on issues that are particularly associated with supporting the Conservatives, that means in particular focusing on immigration, or trying perhaps also to focus on some of what we've come to learn as to call the cultural issues, that they might provide a pathway of getting the Conservatives, of getting voters back. Also by, we've seen more recently focusing on some of the concerns that they may have about the transition on climate change, et cetera, as well as I think frankly the Conservative Party will also want to talk about Brexit. They were hoping to reconnect with their core electorate. The trouble is, however, is to whether or not, and of course they've also trying to persuade people that the current Prime Minister at least is competent. Whatever your views about his two predecessors, this at least is a regular guy who can run the country effectively. So combination of competence and appealing traditional Conservative values seems to be the Conservative strategy. And hoping that perhaps also a few tax cuts will also come along the way. Okay. The trouble is that if you actually look to see what are the things that have driven down support for the Conservative Party and are still driving down support for the Conservative Party, none of those things really feature. Problem number one is what I would call the ethical issue, which is effectively, and amazingly, you might think we stopped talking about lockdown. We've not stopped talking about lockdown. Public First did a fascinating poll asking people about what do you think of the pluses and minuses of the Conservative regime. in the last 13 years. And breaking the rules on lockdown is in the top 5, okay? And we have to remember the Conservative Party was not behind in the polls until lockdown and Partygate first hit on the snare. Problem number 2 is the economy. Conservative voters who think the economy is doing badly voted Conservative in 2019, much less likely now to say they're going to vote Conservative. The third problem is the NHS. People who think the NHS is in a dire state, who voted Conservative in 2019, are much less likely to vote Conservative. And at the moment, at least, it is concern about the state of the public services that trumps a wish for lower levels of taxation. Conversely, if you look at people's evaluations of what's been happening to immigration, yes, lots of Conservative voters think it's too high, but it's almost unrelated to whether or not Conservative people who voted Conservative in 2019 have defected from the Conservatives. So immigration is not the problem. Leadership, yes, is the problem, but persuading people to forget the ethics of leadership is not that easy. Oh, and by the way, and I remembered this because at the moment I'm having to write about the 97 election. And of course, what we're looking at the moment is incredibly similar to 1997, a government that in part at least has been ended up where it is because of a fiscal stroke financial crisis, and governments tend not to survive those, but the Liz Truss fiscal event is hanging around this government. But also the John Major regime of 92 to 97 cut taxes, both in 1995 and in 1996, and it didn't do any good because you are also then looking at an electorate that was concerned about the state of public services. Now, true, the Labour Party didn't quite twig to the fact that this was the problem, and not even they believed that actually the public were willing to spend more taxes. The Labour Party eventually got there by about 1999, after 2 years in office. So the view I take is at the end of the day, what the Conservative Party has to be able to do is it has to be able to campaign on the economy, and it has to be able to campaign on the NHS. In other words, it has to be able to answer 2 questions. Can I feed my kids? And if I fall ill, will the NHS be able to look after me? And at the moment, there are too many people out there who give a negative answer to that question. And unless and until the Conservatives can give an answer to that question, their chances of the staging of enough of a recovery to be in office after the next election at the moment don't look that bright.
Thank you very much, Sean. That's a wonderfully comprehensive answer to that. Thank you. I'm now going to go and pick some of the questions up from the Q&A, and just we've got quite a few men here asking questions, which is great. But please, if a few more women want to ask questions as well, please do join in as well. I see there's a few questions here, Kate, around this issue of not, you've sketched out parties, but Jack Newman and there's Darren here and others are asking questions around what about other state actors. We've seen some of the issues around kind of potential spying in Parliament around China, Russian disinformation campaigns, issues like that. Is there a place? How does that fit in? Do you think is that something we should be worried about, or what should go around that?
Yeah, it is really important, and yeah, it's true to say my research is on kind of mainstream actors, and these kind of outside groups or kind of foreign governments are not bound by the same reputational risks that political parties and mainstream actors do. So, it's kind of understandable that they would be responsible for more problematic content and potentially, be using these technologies in ways that are more problematic for democracy. But I do think it's kind of worth thinking about 2 things. So, one, that kind of finding about online political advertising is that it's not massively effective at changing people's minds. So even if other actors are using more problematic content, then the impact of that is not guaranteed. And I think we quite often assume that just because something is happening, it's therefore having this impact. So I think that's really important. The other thing I'd say is that there's an awful lot of talk about voter manipulation, especially by foreign states and foreign actors. Now, I've done a lot of public opinion research about this. It won't come as any surprise, but no one thinks they're being manipulated. They think the other person is being manipulated. And I think this does raise the question of, we know that political views and our voting preferences are really sticky, really difficult to change. So the idea that if I see an ad online, I'm suddenly going to give up these kind of political opinions instantly from seeing 1 or 2 pieces of content is something I really think we need to just stop and pause and think, what kind of manipulation are we talking about here? And therefore, what is it possible for these actors to do? So there's a kind of few, like, you know, they might be doing more problematic things, but that doesn't mean that they're going to have an impact on people.
Thanks very much, Kate. I'm going to use my chair's prerogative a bit more, actually. I see Sarah Pickard, who's a political insight author. She's asked a very interesting question here, which I think touches on some of the slides you were presenting, John, and picks up from 1 or 2 of the other questioners as well, about this idea of the impact of generational change. And I think I'll probably bring it to you as well afterwards, Kate. The generational change, both on terms of campaigning, but also on voting and non-voting, you know, and it kind of maybe, does it speak to that issue as well that you talk about, this divide between social liberalism and social conservatism? Is there a cohort effect happening?
Well, that's a $64,000 question. And I mean, certainly in the long run, if it is a generational phenomenon, then the Conservative Party has an awful lot to worry about. There is some evidence out there, James Tilley at Oxford particularly did quite a lot of work on this, suggesting that to some degree at least, people are more likely to shift towards the Conservative Party as they get older, but this was done well before the kind of sharp divide that we're currently seeing. I mean, the most recent attempt I made to try and begin to get underneath this, which frankly raised more questions than it came up with answers, was to actually see to what extent are these differences in voting behaviour necessarily reflected in and are a consequence of differences in attitudes and values. And the answer is that they're not obviously so. So it's not, for example, the case that younger people are necessarily particularly more left-wing, or at least only very, very recently, literally in the last 2 or 3 years, and that may be a consequence of COVID. And indeed, even more fascinating, younger people are not actually more willing to pay higher taxation than are older people. Almost undoubtedly, of course, because younger people are now being forced, or at least the half of them that go to university, are being forced to pay for the burden of higher education, while the state is spending more and more on health and on social care in the long run because of the aging of the population. So younger people map, so in other words, it doesn't map easily, therefore, onto people's conceptions of left and right. Mm. And the point is that even once you've taken into account people's sense of values, younger people still seem to be more willing to vote Labour and have been willing to do so for quite some time than you would necessarily expect. But whether or not this is going to prove to be a generational effect, or whether it's going to prove to be an age effect, I wouldn't at the moment want to bet, other than to say, from the Conservatives' point of view, they certainly have to hope that it is an age effect and not a cohort effect.
Kate, what do you think from a campaigning perspective? Because if you're talking about digital campaigning, I guess the expectation is that will hit more young people. Or is that accurate even? Or, you know, how does that all play out?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think there's a presumption that, you know, each digital platform is just where young people are. Like, we know, for example, that, you know, the average age of someone using Facebook is like 45 up. So it really depends by platform, and engagement on different platforms is going to be a really important part. And from the campaigns that I've been speaking to, you know, they're planning not to use Facebook to the same extent as they did last time, because they recognize that the user base has changed, and that actually they're going to try and place content on a much larger range of different providers. So, you know, whereas we kind of saw 1 or 2 party accounts last time, it's likely that we'll see them all having like their own TikToks, you know, essentially like trying to use different platforms to reach different voters. But one thing I think is really interesting is, like, we did a bit of work looking at how like voters of different ages prefer to be contacted, and there are some kind of quite clear differences. So, you know, older voters do still prefer door knocking. They prefer that kind of face-to-face interaction, whereas younger voters find that far more intrusive. They prefer that kind of distance. Even phone calls, you know, they don't like answering their phone because it's less socially normal, I suppose. So whereas like having a text message for a young person is fine, for an older voter would be really problematic. So I think there's really interesting dynamics and preferences that campaigns are going to have to start thinking about. You can't just have this blanket approach, but actually working out who to speak to via which different media just places a lot of pressure on campaign organisations. And I think it's only going to exacerbate this challenge of, you know, those larger parties with larger budgets, larger staff bases, having the capacity to reach far more voters than smaller parties.
Thank you very much. We've got quite a few questions about a subject that's long been dear to my heart as well. And I know it is yours, John. I think you're talking to us from Glasgow, Scottish politics. And I know it's a hornet's nest, and we will try to keep this one brief because I know we could all talk for a long time about it. But there's a few people wondering about what this election might mean for Scotland and what some of the things that you're talking about there might mean for Scotland.
Okay, well, of course, in Scotland, there is another dividing line, which it's not completely orthogonal to the two value dimensions I was talking about. Indeed, rather less so than in the past, but which is, you know, you have to regard as separate, and is which is the constitutional question. Okay, and the constitutional question has changed north of the border. It's now also intertwined with Brexit in a way that was not true at the time of the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. But to cut a long story short, electoral politics in Scotland certainly look different now from what we were expecting 2 years ago. 2 years ago, at the time of the Scottish Parliament election, I think you could reasonably characterise politics in Scotland as much more similar to politics in Northern Ireland than to politics in England and Wales. That is, that people who were in favour of independence were virtually all of them voting for the SNP, and virtually nobody who was opposed to independence was voting for the SNP. And this is, by the way, was new. Okay, if you go back 10 years previously, this was not the case. However, although support for independence has not declined during the course of this year, we are still looking at opinion polls that, roughly speaking, say that 48% of people wish to leave the United Kingdom and 52% want to stay in. The link between supporting independence and willing to support the SNP has weakened. And I mean, one poll that was out yesterday, we only got just over 50% of people who are currently supporters of independence saying they would vote for the SNP, well down on the position even the earlier this year, let alone 2 years ago. And the SNP is not picking up amongst unionist voters. So there is now a divorce between support for independence and support for the SNP. Principal beneficiary of which is the Labour Party, which has always been the bridge party in Scotland. It's always been the one party that to some degree could cross the constitutional divide and is now doing so. And why has this happened? Well, essentially, the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon helped to expose the internal divisions inside the SNP, which were already beginning to bubble away in the wake of the transgender debate. And then Humza Yousaf is just nothing like as popular as Nicola Sturgeon. You probably have heard, if you're south of the border, an awful lot about a certain inquiry into the financial position of the SNP. That, in my view, is much less important than the leadership contest and the election of Humza Yousaf. But that therefore, I think, also means it's more fundamental in the sense that the SNP as a political party is finding itself more internally divided and more and less popular than it arguably has been since, well, really 2007 when it first got into power, even though the independence question is still very, very much there.
Thank you very much, John. It's really interesting to see where that goes. And thanks for all your questions. Keep on putting them in the Q&A. We've a bit more time luckily to speak to our two excellent speakers.
So one thing I perhaps I should have
yeah.
said, Peter, just to emphasise, this does therefore mean the Labour Party does have a serious prospect of picking up a considerable number of seats north of the border, and other things being equal, that makes Labour's chances of getting an overall majority. One of the problems of which it faces is a potentially an adverse electoral geography further south, that some of that will be ameliorated. So it's further, but basically, one of the ironies of life is that the decline of the SNP is bad news for the Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Sean. I think it's going to be one actually area that a lot of people, even outside of Scotland, will be looking at as the general election holds into view. There's a few questions here which I think are picking up on this theme of division. Actually, I think Mark Sharper's question asked it in the context of campaigning. But one of the things that struck me about the 2019 general election and the politics of the UK and the years before that was a heightened sense of division, of polarization within the polity, but cephalogically, in terms of technology and in terms of politics. And I'm kind of wondering, and I'd love both of your takes on this, and you can see there's the emergence of wedge issues, you want to call them culture wars issues, the issues around gender recognition, but also around climate change. To what extent do we think 2024 and the election is going to be a polarizing and divisive election? Kate, can you come in first?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So I think we're definitely going to see, well, I think we already have seen, certain parts of the Conservative Party really kind of pushing quite hardline, provocative messaging. These are there is a real kind of need to provoke debate, to raise certain issues up the agenda. And I think, you've seen kind of around immigration, some of the hierarchy of when you ask voters, what's the most important issue? Immigration was quite low until the Conservatives really started pushing quite strong messaging on it, and it started to rise up that priority list. And I think, parties are trying to stimulate debate around the issues that they know help to motivate their natural support base. So I think we are likely to see it. I think often one of the dynamics that we see in kind of online messaging is the really clear points of contrast with kind of appeals to certain groups or certain ideas. And I think there's quite a well-established formula now that is seen to get kind of high numbers of impressions and good levels of engagement. So I think, that kind of very attention grabbing, you instantly get the message kind of up front and center, really incentivizes the use of these quite sensitive and difficult political issues.
Thanks, Kate. John?
Well, I partly covered this earlier. I mean, we will undoubtedly see the attempt being made. I mean, the evidence so far is that the attempt to row back a bit on net zero has not made any difference to the Conservatives' fortunes. We know that transgender is one of those issues where a relatively small section of our society are deeply committed on both sides, on the two sides of the argument. And for much of the rest of the population, it kind of slightly passes them by. And for the most part, people are relatively relaxed about which gender people decide to live in, although there's a bit more of a debate about what we do and under what conditions we do about legal recognition of a gender change. It's also true that actually, I mean, what I've written about in the past is one of the reasons why we're having these arguments about cultural issues is that there's a whole range of things like attitudes towards empire, attitudes towards Britain's past, attitudes towards our ethnic minorities, where socially conservative views were pretty much a widespread social norm. It's a social norm which is now being challenged. It's a social norm which is now much less widely supported. That's why we're having the debate, because things that were once largely consensual are now the subject of debate. And it's those on the socially conservative side of the debate who are feeling uncomfortable because they're finding that things that they thought they could once assume, they can no longer assume. But with the possible exception of transgender, but I just don't think transgender is important enough. The evidence is that they're appealing to a declining market because, as British Social Attitudes pointed out again a few weeks ago, one of the big changes in our society is we sometimes become a bit more left wing and a bit more right wing, but we've definitely become a lot more liberal. So the reason why this debate is happening is because of long run change, which is working against those who are of a socially conservative disposition. So yes, we will see the attempt made, but the truth is that if we want to understand why we are where we are politically, whereas the 2019 election was about a position issue, Brexit, and the ability of one person, Boris Johnson, to corral support for one of the two positions behind the Conservative Party, and that was effectively what determined the outcome of the election. At the moment, we're looking at an election which is effectively going to be determined by what we call the trade valence issues, i.e. things about which there isn't much disagreement so far as the ends are concerned. So point one is there was no constituency out there for people who thought, yeah, sure, it's fine that 10 Downing Street can interpret the coronavirus regulations in a very different way from virtually everybody else in the country. There was no constituency for that. And the discovery of that, together with the feeling that quite a lot of people have that maybe the truth wasn't entirely being told about all of this, is the moment. That's the moment which the Conservatives first of all fell behind in the polls. And the second valence issue is running the economy and the trashing of the Conservatives' reputation for running the economy in the matter of weeks by Liz Truss. The turnover in party support occurs basically within a matter of weeks of those two events, and it is those two things that the Conservative Party have not been able to reverse. Now, the concern about lockdown, the concern about Liz Truss in the economy is as great amongst Leave voters as it is amongst Remain voters, okay? It's as great amongst working class voters as it is amongst middle class voters. So therefore these things happen, support changes, but without necessarily changing the structure.
Very interesting. Thank you, John. One question I want to pick up is a couple of people have asked this, and I think it's got aspects of both the psephological and the kind of campaigning aspect to it, which is about what's happening at the moment in Israel and Palestine, the Gaza conflict.
Yeah.
And Kieran O'Mara is talking here, but what extent does the panel think the recent events concerning Israel-Palestine, including the phenomenon of online and social media engagement and misinformation, could potentially have an impact on the election, especially in those areas where Labour councillors resigned from the party? Kate, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important issue, and I think thinking about the kind of trajectory of the campaign, Labour came out of their conference with such a good bounce in the polls, and I think this has kind of really hijacked the agenda for them, and I think it's actually put the focus on an issue that they've been doing quite well to control, which is this kind of internal party division, and especially bringing up the kind of feelings of anti-Semitism around the party's reputation. So I think it has a really kind of destabilizing potential to throw the kind of Labour Party on the back foot. I think it's going to be very interesting to kind of see how it plays out in terms of whether they're kind of able to come up with a kind of coherent position on that. In terms of the kind of social media angle, I think this kind of shows the real challenge of how you navigate the online environment, because there have been so many examples of pieces of information that have been shared, often by very high profile people that have kind of wide audiences and therefore are able to give a lot of profile to particular videos that have then been gone on to be shown as a fake. This is such a huge issue. It's not a new issue. It's something we've been dealing with for the last 5 years or so. It's how do you establish the authenticity and the credibility of what you're seeing? There are mechanisms. A lot of them place the burden on kind of us as individuals to actually go and do that background work to make sure that we know what we're seeing and that it is from an authentic source. And BBC Verify have been doing some great work around putting out guides to how you can look at whether a video is kind of an old piece of material or is something new, and look at whether it's been adapted and doctored. So there are ways to do it, but this is, I think, going to be the really enduring dilemma, not just for this election, but actually for the kind of future of how digital interacts with our lives, because it is not easy to work out the authenticity of the material that you're seeing online.
Thanks, Kate. John?
Well, of course, the principal reason why the Labour Party has been so united is the prospect of victory after 13, 14 years out of office. That seems to be promised them by the opinion polls, and that always makes it easier to maintain party unity. And of course, a party that's been out of power for so long is particularly hungry to get back into office. But of course, if there is one thing that can trump the wish to maintain party unity, it's a perception that a group of people may be facing an existential crisis. And that is clearly the case, that both those who are sympathetic towards Israel and those who are sympathetic to Palestine both think that their side, quote unquote, of the argument are potentially facing an existential crisis. And therefore, the emotions that stirs just trumps unity. The problem that Sir Keir faces is that, it's true for most part, both Conservative and Labour voters, their most common response, if you ask them which side do you favour, or other questions that get at that, you discover that most people either say both equally, neither, stroke, don't know. Okay. But amongst the minority who do say, I am more sympathetic to one side or the other, or give answers that reveal that sympathy, for the most part, inside the most conservative voters, they are sympathetic to the Israeli side. And on the Labour side, they are sympathetic to the Palestinian side. And of course, given also that the Labour Party represents pretty much virtually all the constituencies with a large Muslim population, those two things in combination mean undoubtedly that amongst those at least who have a view, Labour's electorate, and unsurprisingly, therefore, the Labour Party membership, are more inclined to express a Palestinian perspective. And yeah, to that extent, Sir Keir's got a problem. Now, that said, is there any evidence so far that any of this is doing any damage to the Labour Party or Sir Keir? My answer to that question is no. There was one opinion poll that came out and said, "Whoa, gee whiz, Sir Keir Starmer's popularity is down." But actually, if you looked at the detail of that poll, all of the decline in his popularity occurred amongst opposition voters. Sir Keir's popularity amongst Labour voters was unchanged. And also that finding has not been replicated by other opinion polls. Now, Sir Keir is not the most popular of leaders. He's got a popularity problem, but it's not clear that it's any greater now than it was before this conflict came out, and some of his statements on that. And certainly, if anything, Labour's lead in the opinion polls is higher at the end of October than it was at the beginning of October. So yes, this is creating the internal argument, but again, it could potentially cause Labour an issue in some Muslim constituencies, though you have to ask yourself where they're going to go, because it's not clear that there is any political party out there that's particularly, it's not like the Iraq War where people could go and vote for Liberal Democrats because the Liberal Democrats took a very different view. So Ed Davey is not taking a particularly different view. But you can certainly see why there's internal dissension. But the truth is, Sir Keir is probably going to have to ride it out. If he's got any sense, he's going to have to allow internal dissension on the issue, because otherwise he's going to create grief for himself that probably just isn't worth it.
Thank you very much, John. I'm going to wrap up in a moment. We'll have one last question. But before we go, I just want to say a huge thanks to our speakers, to John and to Kate. I want to say a huge thanks to the team at the PSA, who've done such an amazing job of putting this together. A big thank you to Sage Publishing. Huge thanks to you, the audience, for coming along. And the PSA is going to be sending a recording to all of you who've registered. And I also want to say a quick plug for Political Insight magazine. As you can tell from this lecture, there's going to be a lot to talk about in 2024. Whenever the election takes place, we're still going to be covering it very, very intensely in the coming months. Delighted to say both Kate and John will have a piece in the next issue, the December issue, which will be a kind of a wrap up and a summary of their lecture today, which is great. So So please keep on board Political Insight, keep reading, and I'm sure we won't be, as I say, we won't be stuck for comment analysis and research in the coming months. Before we go though, I just wanted to, Lana's got a question I thought would just might be quite a good little, kind of almost like a quick rounder-upper. What do you think, Lana asks, would have the potential to shift the general election results in 2024? Kate, do you want to go in first?
Which question to end on? That's the kind of big unknown. I think there's nothing quite like a good crisis to throw things on the back foot. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's quite challenging to kind of put your real finger on. There's so many different variables that go on. God, let John come in and see if he can spark some more coherent thoughts from me.
Yeah, my answer to you, Peter, is a dramatic improvement in the economy and a significant reduction in waiting times for the health service. The question you then have to ask yourself is, how likely do you think those two events are?
Is it a Deus Ex Machina or not? It's basically the question. Is it likely to happen or not? Well, I think we'll find out a lot more in the coming months. And as I say, thank you so much, John, and thank you so much, Kate, for so much fantastic insight. It's been a really fascinating, stimulating lecture. And thanks again for everybody who's come to turn up today. And you'll be hearing more from Political Insight and from the Political Studies Association in the coming months. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Peter.